Oh, there we go.
What does it say now?
We're ready.
All right. Hi, everybody. This is Yana Ludwig. I'm running for United States Senate here in Wyoming. This is my usual Thursday Facebook Live, but for the next few weeks at least, we're going to mix it up a little bit. I'm doing something a little bit different, and we're going to have a guest with us. And this week, my first guest is Carl Beach, who is running for Wyoming's U.S. House seat. And want to welcome Carl here. And I got excited when Carl declared for a number of reasons. One of those is that first of all, he's from Ryan Park, Wyoming, so he's joining us today from home. And he has this really sweet balance between the kind of like states' rights and local focus stuff and wanting really solid support and accountability from the federal level. And I resonate a lot with riding that balance point. And we also have a similar cluster of key issues, although we're definitely not identical in how we talk about stuff or exactly what we're holding with it. We're both really strong on workers' rights and ecological concerns and justice issues. And so it's great to have somebody else in one of these federal races from Wyoming who has a similar orientation to mine. And so welcome, Carl. And I'm just going to turn it over to you for however long.
All right. So you broke up a little bit there.
You want to welcome.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Well, good. Thank you, first of all, for having me and inviting me to this collaboration. I really appreciate it. And I think it's, it's just a pleasure to have this time and this audience. And, we're not competing against each other, obviously. But I think regardless of that, finding common ground among all the different candidates is important, and that we can draw a focus and to issues that are meaningful for Wyoming, and just having that collaboration is always going to be good. It's going to be good for Wyoming and good for the United States. So I'm really happy to be here, and so thank you again. It's great. So and you're right. You and I, in looking at our platforms, we definitely have common ground that we can draw from and build upon. So. If you go to my website, you'll see I kind of identified 8 areas that I see as being really important at this time. But, for the sake of, people's attention span and other things, it's good to focus on a couple, 3 that I think are really important right now. And that is, for me, it's healthcare, economic stability, and workers' rights, as you mentioned. And then I think the third one that's really important is conservation, public lands, and the environment. All of these I see as really pressing issues and things that that we have to focus on, as you said, at a local level, a state level, and then of course a national level, and then finally when we're talking about environment, a international level. There's no way to deny the interplay between all those different levels. So those are the 3 things that I tend to focus on right now. But of course, a lot of those are also intertwined and interdependent on each other. So yeah, so those are kind of the 3 main ones that I look at.
Great. So do you want to say a little bit about what you're particularly interested in terms of like what's your healthcare plan? When you think about conservation, I know public lands is a big piece of that for you. So just go ahead and say a little bit more about each of those 3 areas, and then we can talk about them a little bit.
Cool. Yeah. So like you, I actually am a proponent of a single payer system. Just watching your last week's podcast, Facebook Live on healthcare, I definitely align a lot of ways with you on that. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But I think you identified a key issue, and that is that, the poorest and sometimes the people with the most health issues may be forced to go into the public sphere if we have a 2-tiered system, therefore underfunding it in some ways, and that would be problematic. I would also like to extend on that, and the reason I'm a proponent of a single payer system is multiple. But one of those reasons is because I don't think we have a long history of a lot of faith in some of our public systems. If you look at other countries, they do have that long history of faith in their public systems. And so when you go to some of these countries, even if they do have a 2-tiered system, no one necessarily says, oh, the public system's worse. They just think of it as an option, right? But I fear that in the US, we would have that kind of unfortunate thought process that somehow the free market is better, right? And so in good times, people would migrate to the free market system. And then, of course, in bad times, like we're seeing now, they would all then jump back to the public system and leaving, again, underfunded and not viable. But the second reason I'm really for a single payer healthcare system is because I think it will really benefit rural areas like Wyoming, providing more equitable service, right? Mm-hmm. So I think your guest talked about the national health system in England. And, I liked his example that he's like, oh, I can go to Liverpool and on vacation and I'm going to get the same service. And I think that's what we're going to really see here in Wyoming, for example, that it's going to be much more equitable across the state. And you're going to get the same service that you're going to see in, I don't know, Meeteetse than you're going to see like in Denver, right? Or Billings or something like that. And I think that's where I see a single payer health system really paying off for people in Wyoming. And something that I think would be really beneficial. Because right now we're seeing, again, a system where rural hospitals really depend on elective procedures to fund themselves or to keep themselves in the black. And that is, I think that affects the way in which the system works and incentivizes things that are not necessary for a lot of people around the state.
Right. Yeah. It's like in some ways, I feel like that concept of like in network and out of network is one of the most disastrous things that has happened with our healthcare system, because it really is true that like, if I break my arm in Jackson, like I might not be able to find like an in-network option for that, or if I get sick or, something like that. And, and so the fact that it's so spotty from place to place and that like healthcare is really different in different places. I have some friends who have chronic and ongoing issues, and like they're driving 5-6 hours to get to like the specialist that is okay for their insurance. And it's like, this is kind of crazy. Like they drove past 3 people who could have given them the same service on their way, but because this one person like jumped through some hoops with the big insurance company, they're able to go to that person. So yeah, it's incredibly messy right now. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, great. Yeah. And that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that sort of yo-yo effect that you're talking about with like, during good times, people might gravitate toward the private insurance. And so like, I feel like that's an interesting piece that I haven't really thought through the implications of. So great. This is why we should be talking to each other.
That's right. Well, that's right. Everyone has, again, the different viewpoints, from where you're coming from and how you see things, being applied in different areas. I mean, we can't, a lot of times we make that mistake. We're like, oh, let's apply, a system from, I don't know, Germany or the Netherlands or wherever to here. And that may or may not work. But I think we can take the viewpoints and some of the ways in which they do apply, like a healthcare system and utilize them as models to do something here in the US that can be really great. I mean, we often look at our military, for example, as the best in the world, a public funded aspect to our government that we consider one of the best in the world. I would like to shift that as well into, our healthcare system. And we have a chance to make the best healthcare system in the world that is good for everybody. And that, to me, that kind of shifting of our perspective would be so beneficial for people around the US. And so that's something I would hope for, right? Utilizing the models that we have across the world, but developing a system for ourselves that we can truly be proud of. And make sure that everyone in the U.S. has healthcare coverage for their own stability and security.
Yeah, and I think about it like I feel like our medical personnel in the United States are like pretty well trained. Like I feel like we have one of the best systems in terms of like who we have doing that work and like the quality of work that they're doing, and the system around them is horrible and like doesn't at all support that expertise. And we see like there's been some interesting interviews with people in medical school right now who are basically saying like, I don't want to practice within our current system. Like I'm thinking about like leaving the US after med school to like go somewhere else where like the insurance system around it and the payment system actually really supports the quality of education that I'm getting right now is outstanding. And like, I'm not sure this is the place to practice. And I'm like, that feels really sad to me. And it feels like we're sort of falling down on the job in some significant ways. And it's not about the quality of our medical personnel at all. It's about like what's around that and the context that they're having to operate in.
Right. Yeah, that's another example of like almost like a brain drain, right? That you get people who are dedicated to a specific industry or field, and then they leave because they don't work well within that environment, right? Which I think we see this. So we were talking, another aspect to our platforms is about, economic stability and workers' rights, right? And this is another area that I think Wyoming suffers from. Many people leave the state who grew up here because the opportunities are just not there, right? They're just not developed enough, or there's other factors involved. And yeah, so I mean, I think we see that consistently happening to a lot of our population. So young people feel, opportunities aren't available to them that could be. So whether that's, ensuring that we have better internet access across the state in terms of rural communities, I think that's an important aspect that we need to do to increase the attractiveness to Wyoming, right? I mean, I think we're a great state for that. We have abundant outdoor activities, great lifestyle, lots of, I mean, maybe not in March, some people, March, April, but overall we have some really great, aspects of the state that we can capitalize on. But we have to have that infrastructure to keep people here. And included in that, as I think you and I both agree on, is, ensuring that there's a base level of security for workers of all levels where they can, live good, comfortable lives and feel good about their situation wherever they may be, Laramie, Rock Springs, doesn't matter at Sheridan, that they can pay the rent, that they have sick leave, that they have security in their health insurance, which again, workers' rights to me and health insurance go hand in hand, right? They go right together. You can't feel secure if you feel like you can't go to the emergency room because of overreaching bills and the possibility that might bankrupt you. You can't do it. You'll never feel secure. And and I know what that feels like. I was at that point in my life once. It's horrible. It's a horrible feeling, I mean, I was lucky, I was young and healthy, but yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think the state is pretty close, although the state's also looking at laying off a bunch of people right now. And Walmart absolutely provides no security for people. I mean, the wages are bad enough that, like, as US taxpayers, we spend about $1 million per year per store on social services to Walmart employees. And it's like, Walmart's just like basically bankrupting our communities. And they've put a lot of small businesses out of business in the process of like coming in and sort of taking over the local market. And of course, we also have fossil fuel industries that are, starting to be on sort of the descendant at this point. And, and I don't know how you think about this, but the way that I've been talking about coal in Wyoming is basically that I see coal. I think the most productive way to see it at this point is that coal's in hospice, that, we have this like beloved member of our community who has, like my kids have terrific public schools because of fossil fuels. And I'm super aware of that. And I think we can't diminish the value of what fossil fuels have brought to the state. And it's dying, and like being in denial about that isn't actually going to help anybody. And I feel like, the best thing we can be doing right now is to be really taking care of coal workers and not letting these sort of like serial vulture capitalists come in and like take over coal companies and then screw the workers over every couple of years as they're going into repeated bankruptcies. Like that feels like the worst possible thing that we could be doing in terms of taking care of our workers. And when someone's in hospice, you're also making plans for what's next. Like you're not going like, oh, they're going to be here forever. It's like, well, they're not going to be here forever. And so what do we actually need to be doing? And so that's kind of how I've been framing it. And I don't know how you think about like that intersection between like workers' rights and coal and oil and climate disruption, which is another thing that you and I both have, some attention on. So would love to hear from you about that intersection.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great analogy. I do. I think that's a really great way to look at it. And again, I think that's the problem, is there's a bit of a denial there, and there's a bit of reluctance to move forward because of that kind of culture and history that's a part of our state. And I get it. My dad was a coal miner, and I understand kind of how that happens. And I understand how it affects a community as well. In my 45 years, I think I've lived through 3 boom and bust cycles here, right? I see that, and I've seen the effects of it. In my mind, I think we have to recognize the reality of the situation. And that's, again, it works on both levels. The first level is the economic one, and then, as you said, the climate and the ecological one, right? There's kind of on 2 levels. On the economic side, we have to recognize that regardless of whether or not coal or oil or gas or anything continues to motor along, no pun intended, for a certain amount of time, that we're going to see that reduction in workforce is going to happen. That's just because of technology and AI. Automation, technology continues to increase, and we've seen that trend since the early 19th century. That technology reduces the workforce while increasing production. Well, now we're also seeing a reduction in the market. Mm-hmm. So those 2 factors are going to reduce the workforce no matter what we do. And so that's the economic aspect, and we're going to have to deal with that in some way. So that means transitioning people to different skills, different skill sets that are more in line with the modern economy and the jobs of the future. And those are things that can't be replaced by AI. Emotional intelligence, empathy, creativity, right? These are the skills that our education system needs to develop, as well as transitioning people to deal with those different skills on a technological format. On the environmental aspect, the second component of that is that even if you don't believe in climate change, the rest of the world does. And so we are the only ones that withdrew really from the Paris Accord, right? So we're kind of the lone shark out there right now that's kind of swimming alone there. The rest of the world is moving forward with these targets of reducing carbon emissions, reducing our impact on the environment, and that market is going to continue to proliferate. Green energy, green markets are going to start opening up, and we can either take our ball and go home, or we can decide to get in that game. And I see that as a part of what we can do here in Wyoming. Fossil fuels will always be in the mix because we utilize them in different ways to create new technologies. We understand that. But the demand is not going to be anywhere near what it was, and we have to recognize that. So to me, that's where we really need to move forward on, is trying to make sure that we understand that new technologies, new markets are going to open up, and we got to be on the forefront of identifying them and capitalizing on them.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and that makes a ton of sense to me. And, particularly around like solar and wind are the ones that get talked about the most frequently. And there's a reason for that. Like we actually have abundant sun and abundant wind in Wyoming, and that's not true everywhere. Like we're pretty well positioned to be able to be making use of it. And I've been thinking about it more as like, so we have these abundant resources under the ground that we've been really focused on. And we also have abundant resources above the ground. And like now we can like start tapping into those in a much more like deliberate way. Like it's not that there aren't like windmills all over the state at this point that you can see. And, we've got a lot more potential to be doing a lot more of that. And I'm actually in favor of local communities creating microgrids for their communities. One of the bizarre things last summer when I could still drive around the state and like meet with people was driving sometimes for like hours, and like there's no people, but there's the electrical wires the entire time. And it's like, so this is actually incredibly wasteful, like electricity running along those wires. Like some of it just gets lost. There's this thing called line loss. And so it's not only the resources going into creating that infrastructure, but also, it's just a really inefficient way to be delivering electricity. And so I would love to see like locally controlled microgrids and like really restore some of that power and control and that income to our local communities so that they're, being able to like provide their own electricity locally for themselves. And so that's something I've gotten excited about as I've wandered about the state.
And I think I agree with you. I think we have a great potential to realize that, more so than maybe in other places. And you're right. I mean, I think, one of the obstacles early on in wind energy for Wyoming was the fact that we were so isolated and unable to transfer that energy anywhere, right? So that was a huge obstacle that has now started to be overcome. but that was part of the issue. And I think you're right. The way, again, like I said, technology is increasing at such an exponential rate that, it's hard for us, to plan 5 years from now really what's going to, happen in that regard. But I do foresee, that we're going to have much better energy capture solutions and storage solutions that will allow for those to be developed easier, cheaper, and more efficiently. So I think that's a great potential way to move forward here in Wyoming as well.
Cool. So one of the things I find fascinating about you and I is that we have so much in common in terms of how we think about stuff. And you're from here. I mean, you're a lifelong, you left for education for a little while, but you're pretty much a lifer in Wyoming. And I've been here for about 4 years. And so that's really different. And we often get the there's this attitude about people who weren't born here. And so I'm in the roughly 50% of the people living in the state right now who aren't from here. And you're in the roughly 50% of the state of people who have been here all along. And I find it really interesting, that we can get to such similar places coming from really different backgrounds, but also I think there is something really compelling and important about having some people representing us who have been here lifelong. And that's one of the things, Mike Enzi, who I'm running to replace, was one of those people. Barrasso and Cheney aren't people who have lived in Wyoming their whole lives and, are representing us. And I think that having that deep rootedness of lifelong experience is really terrific. And I also think that having some of us who have lived in lots of different places. I've experienced state governments in 7 different states at this point, and have some sense of what's different, and also am bringing in ideas from other places and whatnot. And I just find it really interesting. I would love to have us think about I think diversity in length of time that people have lived in Wyoming could actually be considered an asset if we weren't so busy protect people like me being defensive about it and in the state the whole time being oh, but you're not from here. And so, yeah, I don't know. So I don't know what thoughts you have about that kind of stuff, and what the experience that those years that you spent not in Wyoming, how you feel that's kind of flavored your perspective. And then you're somebody who came back, and that's not always true. A lot of our young people leave and they don't come back, but right. You did.
I did. Well, yeah. Again, my family has, for the most part, retain, their, like you said, their roots here and continue to live here consistently. Although my parents had to move away to Nebraska for a while, again, just because of job fluctuations in the market, right? That's just right. That's part of, being in such a rural community. Sometimes things fluctuate and they really affect, quite a significant portion of that population. So, but my parents, always wanted to stay here. When they came to Wyoming in the 1970s, to them, they thought it was the most beautiful place they'd ever, seen, and just were so captured by it. So, they've really focused on staying here. And yeah, I think, there's no doubt that where you're from informs who you are. That's part of it, right? I in my video, and I always, when I was teaching abroad and different places, I always joked about, going 100 kilometers to the, movie theater. That, gives you a sense of that, for some people in Europe, driving 100 kilometers to do anything is quite significant, right? And so those are things that, I do think do inform, kind of the base of who you are and how you see things from a perspective that is different than maybe someone who grew up in a less rural area or not in Wyoming.
Yeah.
Or, for me, when I look at food production, I look at it very differently, because I remember growing up here and I hated tomatoes because I had never had a good tomato,
right. Not fresh from the garden.
Yeah. And it's still true today, that getting good produce here is sometimes difficult. And, those are things that I think, did get me to understand and then appreciate how other places utilize, farm to table, or, that's a newer term that's come about in the last 10 years. But if you go to certain countries, it's always been farm to table, right? So, for me, like, yeah, the kind of, I guess, interplay between growing up here and then leaving and then seeing all these different, cultures and ways of doing things abroad has really made me reappreciate a lot of the things that I with here, and also come back with a different critical eye on how to improve things, not to do things the same way, but just to understand that there are new ways to do things and think, that, and my dad and I were just having a conversation about, building here in Wyoming that I thought was cool. So I just got back from Poland and both in Poland, and then I was also in the Pyrenees of southern France, and they utilize things like, they keep the snow on their roofs, and it's not because they get less snow, it's because they use it as an insulating factor. Whereas here in Wyoming, we're always trying to get rid of the snow on our roofs, right? Again, like looking at those different aspects to say, oh, okay, like this, why is it done this way? And how could we, utilize those examples to maybe, make things work better or, change things a little bit. So just, little things like that are things that now I really appreciate between the two areas, two parts of the worlds I've lived in, I guess you could say.
Nice. Yeah, I keep thinking, I have I have friends all over the country and I've worked all over the country, and sometimes they get baffled by things, and I'm like, this is just a grew up rural thing. Like I noticed, like, I live on a gravel road now, and I was in town in Laramie for the first couple years that I was here, and I'm now back on a gravel road, and I sort of figure that you grew up rural if, like, the minute you're in the driver's seat on a gravel road and you see another car, your hand just starts doing this automatically. And you don't even think about it. Like,
right.
This is like universal rural America kind of, programming, is like you just are doing that sort of like friendly neighbor wave whenever you're in a rural area. And so it's been fun sort of thinking about, like, how is Wyoming really unique, and how is Wyoming, rural America, the same way as all of those other places that I've lived that were, mostly rural places. So it's been really interesting thinking about that. And, running for office, you get a lot of people like concerned about where you're from. And so I've had a lot of time to think about it over the last year. Like, what do I feel like is just rural America? And I know that stuff,
Yeah.
What do I need to be really respectful about that is, really uniquely Wyoming?
That's right.
Yeah.
I think that's where, again, growing up here, I can't shed that off, that's part of, my identity. And I think, that's a really positive thing in a lot of ways. I mean, when we were kids, we were always trying to escape it, but then you come back and realize, how great it was to grow up in this area. I mean, for me, having a, million-acre playground is so unique, compared to a lot of people in the world. It's just it's a different experience.
Right. Nice. Okay, so so we're getting close to the half-hour mark, but there's one other thing that I really want to celebrate with you before we wrap up, and that is, so you've been doing a podcast, the Ryan Park Chronicles, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going to invite you to go ahead and put your links in the chat after we're done with this, for your website, Beach for Wyoming, and one of the podcast episodes that I'd listened to was this really interesting and thoughtful piece, I thought, about white male privilege. And, and so we're both white people running for office in a state who has, as near as I can tell, always elected white people to represent them federally. And I think we're both pretty tuned into, like, that's a sensitive thing. And it's not like, white people who are like, we're running to have more power, and we already have a lot of power as white people. And so I just want to really celebrate for the folks that are partly excited about my candidacy, because I am tuned into those kinds of social justice issues and whatnot, to really check out, that piece that you did on privilege, and just hear the level of thoughtfulness that I feel like you bring into those issues. And, want to give you a chance to, like, say a little bit about that part and, like, how you relate to kind of justice issues, because I know that's important to a lot of people that are following me.
Yeah, well, thank you. Those were very kind words. And you're right. It's really hard to negotiate that world, right? I mean, it's you don't want to be like a white apologist and just be like, well, I can't help it, that I'm white,
right.
That kind of thing. because I think part of that is recognizing that, there's times for you to step down and step back, right? There's times open that space up and, invite other people to get involved and support them and that. And for me, yeah, running was part of the decision-making process for me, was like, what do I have to bring, besides, my white maleness to this table, right? What is it, and it's something I recognize and really try to reflect on consistently. But I think, we started to see, across even in the free market, in the economic world, we are starting to see ways in which companies and organizations are really distributing leadership differently, flattening things out more, and giving, that space for people to really contribute in different ways. And so for me, even if as a candidate running, that's the type of leadership that I would like to bring, if I were to be elected. And I think that allows for not just more voices to be brought to the table, but also, as you said, to see them from different perspectives in a way that can be really truly progressive and sort of bring about change that is going to really help out underserved communities, people of color, like things of that nature. So I think sometimes you do have to throw your hat in the ring, even though you may think, oh geez, like this is not the perfect scenario, but you hope that in doing so you can help bring more people to the table and bring those issues to light. So that would be kind of where I guess I come from in recognizing that I'm running as this white man.
Yeah. So you're not going to be doing the kinds of stuff that Liz Cheney's been doing about, like, the tribes are ruining our Western way of life. Like, oh my God, did she actually say that?
Yeah.
She did. Yeah. Yeah. The irony of a white woman saying that. It's like, really, Liz?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Yeah. And, that interesting idea of way of life, right? And I agree with, like, we can identify what that means. Like, we can see it, like, we know what it means in a lot of ways, right? But it is still kind of elusive, and it means different things to different people.
Right.
And I think currently we're seeing an influx of fairly wealthy individuals coming to Wyoming and, playing cowboy on a ranch. And that's very different than the way of life I grew up with, right? That's not the same thing. A lot of ranches around here for me have been bought up, consolidated. A lot of family ranches have been taken over. And that's something I think, if we want to protect our way of life, we have to protect those ranchers. We have to help support them in maintaining their independence. And so you're right. Like, it's funny, like how I'm not going to be that.
Well, thank you for not being that.
Yeah, and recognizing that our indigenous populations here in the United States have suffered greatly, greatly, and we'll never be able to make up for that, no matter what we do. And we consistently need to be thoughtful and engaging with them, and trying to help them to provide a situation that betters them on their terms, not our terms, right? So I think that's really important, and that takes a lot of listening, a lot. And that's actually why I don't have currently any part of my platform has a section on Indigenous rights at the moment, even though I'd want to put that there, because I haven't been a part of that community lately for the last 20 years. I still have friends in the Wind River Reservation, but I want to go and talk to them before I make any real, strong statements or stances currently. I feel I need to reconnect before I do that.
Nice. Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Carl, for being with us. You want to, so for folks that aren't going to look at the chat stuff, you want to just say what your social media and other contacts are?
Sure.
So folks can find you?
Yeah, luckily, since my name is strange in, combined with Wyoming, it's easy to put Beach for Wyoming for everything, because we're just like, an oxymoron. But Glendale Reservoir, no, just kidding. No. So, Beach for Wyoming is pretty much the handle for all of my social media. And so at Beach for Wyoming for everything, whether that's Snapchat or, Facebook, all the different social media accounts. And then my website is beachforwyoming.org. And that's where you can find also links to all those different sites as well there. And yeah, you can see more about me and my platform at that space.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for being with me today, Carl. I appreciate you taking the time, and check out Beach for Wyoming, everybody.
Thank you, Yana. I really appreciate it. It's been great.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Yana.